Good evening, everyone. Are you as excited as we are?
Yes.
We've worked for this event over 3 years. So, yeah, long time coming. I'm Claudia Yagubi, Director of the Center for the Middle East and Islamic Studies, your host, and Professor of Persian Studies. I'm thrilled to be here with you this evening, welcoming our guest of honor, Dr. Cornel West. I would also like to welcome our esteemed guests, faculty, students, staff, community members, our provost, deans, and board of trustee members, and leadership on campus. I want to tell you briefly about the vision that led to the organization of this event. My interaction with Dr. West go beyond my reading of his scholarship. During a remarkable panel discussion centered on Iranian women in academia, organized by the University of California, Irvine, on November 6, 2020, I had the extraordinary privilege of sharing the stage with Dr. West's beloved wife, and my dear friend, Dr. Anahita Mahdawi West, who's here in the audience today. Dr. West himself graced that event with his inspiring presence and enthusiastic support of us. The atmosphere was eclectic with a sense of shared purpose and intellectual exchange. As we delved into the intricate challenges and triumphs faced by Iranian women in the academic sphere, Dr. West's affirmations from the audience resonated deeply, infusing our dialogue with an even greater sense of significance. His presence served as a powerful reminder of the interconnectedness of struggles for justice and equality, regardless of cultural and geographical boundaries. The memory of Dr. West's encouragement fueled my commitment to promoting similar conversations within academia, an enduring testament to the transformative impact of shared passions and solidarity. The decision to invite Dr. West to address the intersection of social justice movements within Middle Eastern and Black communities was born out of that moment. It was a visionary and profound pursuit. Fast forward 2 years later, when I was appointed director of the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies in March 2022, I began working on securing partnerships across campus to bring this vision to life, which was originally, as you know, scheduled for September 15, 2023. Over the next year and a half, I partnered with many inspiring leaders across campus who are present here tonight, sitting in the audience and on the reserved section. And I partnered with the College of Arts and Sciences, the Program for Public Discourse, the Institute for the Arts and Humanities, the Center for the Study of American South, Department of Gender and Women's Studies, Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and Curriculum in Global Studies. You all have my utmost gratitude. This partnership has been one of the most fulfilling experiences of my career as a director. I would also like to recognize my wonderful staff and team in the center without whom this would not possible. It would have been impossible to pull it off. Dr. Micah Hughes, huge shout out. Alan Hamuda, Courtney Philippi, and Megan McIntyre. They have worked tirelessly to make this happen. Tonight, Dr. West's unparalleled ability to bridge diverse perspectives, coupled with his profound insights into the struggles against oppression and inequality, will undoubtedly enrich our conversation on the crucial connection between the experiences of these two communities, while acknowledging their unique challenges. So now I would like to turn you to our Provost Chris Clements, for his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Claudia. All right, we still have some folks outside. If Brother West is here, it's about love and fellowship. Squeeze in. If you've got an empty seat, scoot over. This is your chance. Make room on the end. Let's get as many folks in and fill it up. Because I don't want people to have to stand outside if we get seated. So don't be shy. All right. Thank you to the UNC Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies and to Claudia for sponsoring tonight's event and for asking me to introduce our distinguished guests. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone attending to please remain respectful of fellow attendees and our speakers. If you get a chance right now, silence your cell phone. And please remember that the Campus Free Speech Act, passed by the North Carolina General Assembly in July 2017, requires us to protect the rights of the audience to see and hear the event and to protect the right of the speakers to be heard and seen. Any person who disrupts the event or interferes with the rights of those in attendance to hear or see the speakers will be asked to leave. Anyone who does not leave when asked or does not put down signs which obstruct the audience view will be removed and may be subject to arrest. Now, that's my public service message. Now for the fun. This is a privilege for me to introduce our guest, Dr. Cornel West, affectionately known to many as Brother West. He is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Chair at Union Theological Seminary. Dr. West teaches on the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as well as courses in philosophy of religion, African American critical thought, and a wide range of subjects, including, but by no means limited to, the classics, philosophy, politics, cultural theory, literature, and music. He has a passion to communicate to a vast variety of publics in order to keep alive the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a legacy of telling the truth and bearing witness to love and justice. The son of a teacher and a civilian U.S. Air Force administrator, Dr. West was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma. As the post-World War II baby boom neared its peak, but he spent most of his childhood in Sacramento, California. Dr. West studied civilization and Near Eastern languages at Harvard University, earning his bachelor's degree with honors in just 3 years, and graduated magna cum laude from Harvard and obtained his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton. After finishing his PhD in 1980, he quickly established himself as a titan of academia and one of America's leading intellectuals. Throughout his career, Dr. West has held various prestigious academic positions, including appointments at Princeton, Harvard, and Union Theological Seminary. He has written 20 books and edited 13. He's best known for his classics, Race Matters and Democracy Matters, and for his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. His most recent book, Black Prophetic Fire, offers an unflinching look at 19th and 20th century African American leaders and their visionary legacies. Beyond academia, Dr. West is renowned for his passion and activism. In addition to his scholarly and activist pursuits, Dr. West is a prolific author, contributing regularly to publications and engaging in dialogue with a broad audience. His engagement in political discourse extends to his role as public commentator, offering insightful and provocative perspectives on contemporary issues, and even running for the presidency of the United States. Dr. West has written essays for the Washington Post, the New York Times, recorded 3 spoken word albums, and appeared in the Matrix film trilogy twice. Brother West's ferocious intellect never outshines his underlying passion for humanity. He's fundamentally a man, quote, trying to love his crooked neighbor with his crooked heart, unquote, as he often says, paraphrasing the English poet W.H. Auden. In his opinion, examining your life with honesty, courage, and compassion isn't just a moral obligation. It is, he says, one of the great joys of being alive. Like the jazz musicians he reveres, he has always valued flexibility, improvisation, and the rejection of rigid and reductive views. A dynamic and charismatic speaker, Dr. West has a unique ability to bridge the gap between scholarly analysis and the concerns of everyday people. Tonight's conversation about solidarities between Middle Eastern and Black communities promises to be a significant and timely dialogue, highlighting the intersections of experiences, struggles, and aspirations shared by these communities. Joining Dr. West in conversation will be some of our own faculty. Professor Youssef Carter, I'll ask him to come out. Professor Carter is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and the Keenan Rifai Fellow in Islamic Studies. Professor Nadia Yaqub. Professor Yaqub is a professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. Professor Christian Lundberg will be serving as moderator for our conversation. Dr. Lundberg is the Jeff and Jennifer Allred Professor of Public Speaking and Debate and a founding faculty in UNC's program for Public Discourse and the School of Civic Life and Leadership. In 2019 and 20, Dr. West served UNC as a member of the advisory board for the program for Public Discourse. He was chosen for his history of advocating for unity among diverse groups in the pursuit of justice and equality. In the spirit of Dr. West's emphasis on love, justice, and the pursuit of a better society, let's welcome him one more time to UNC.
What a great night. I got a hug from a person with 20 books and from the Matrix, which is very exciting, I think, for all of us. My name's Chris, and I have 3 kind of points of order to take care of before we go. The first and perhaps the most exciting is a disclaimer. Dr. Cornel West is appearing in his personal capacity at this event and not on behalf of any federal campaign committee. This event is not an endorsement for his current presidential campaign. Furthermore, he will not be answering questions in his capacity as a candidate. The audience is reminded that the views and/or comments of the panelists do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the sponsoring programs, the department, or the university. I'll pause for applause. So, the second, and perhaps more exciting, talk a little bit about our format. So, The conversation tonight will essentially happen in two phases. In the first phase, we've got 4 kind of touch point questions to begin with Dr. West. We'll have a dialogue around each of those for approximately 10 minutes. And then the second phase will be Q&A from the audience. So if you have your program, you should have a QR code on the back. So take your phone, take a picture, and send whatever questions that you'd like to ask, and I will dutifully ask them. So I do want to say what an amazing privilege it is to be here, both with Dr. West and colleagues, and it's important to give a sense of everybody on stage. And so I want to give a little bit more of a detailed introduction to Nadia Yacoub, who is a professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and adjunct in English and Comp Lit, and who is known for insightful readings of Arab cultural texts from medieval literature to contemporary oral poetry and cinema. Good? Good. And then, of course, Yusuf Carter is an assistant prof of religious studies, Keenan Rifai Fellow in Islamic Studies. Yusuf is an anthropologist of religion who does fascinating work at the intersection of religious discourse and abolition, and is currently working on African American and West African Sufi spiritual networks book. Yes. Awesome. Welcome everyone. Great to be here with that and 500 of our closest friends. I guess, should we start? Question 1? All right, question 1. So, questions were composed by a committee of faculty, and of course, move right into conversation. So, here's the first. Dr. West, let's talk about comparative movements, both historical and contemporary, of Middle Eastern American and Black American communities. What can we glean from thinking broadly both about the past and the present?
Well, let me first say I am blessed to be back at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Salute the captain of the ship, my dear brother Chris Clemens, and I'm also brother Jim White, the dean. And of course, I wouldn't be here without the distinguished Professor Claudia Yacoub and sit next to I think I'm so very blessed to have each and every one of you here, because in so many ways, you know, when you're in dialogue, it's a beautiful thing. I think Socrates has taught us by example that we begin with a note of intellectual humility. That no one of us have a monopoly on truth or goodness or beauty. Some of us still religious like myself. I'm a revolutionary Christian. Not a Christian revolutionary, a revolutionary Christian. The noun has to do with what the Middle East has unleashed in the history of the species. Going back to our precious Jewish brothers and sisters, that Hesed, spreading that steadfast love and loving kindness to the orphan, the widow, the fatherless, the motherless, the persecuted, the hated, the demeaned, the degraded. And then that Palestinian Jew named Jesus, that means so much to me. I won't get into that right now, but I just love the fact that he went into that temple and ran out those money changes, not because he hated the rich, not because he hated the rich, he hated greed. He hated losing sight of the humanity of others and was willing to pay a cost. And then Muhammad building on that rich legacy. So to begin with Athens and Jerusalem, which were pillars for me, and then to be able to acknowledge our own limitations in many ways when we move to the rich traditions in Asia and those very profound formulations that you get in traditional religions, be it in Africa, be it in our precious indigenous peoples here and around the world. So we have a framework to put this. Last but not least, I want to dedicate my remarks to my very dear brother. I loved him so deeply and respected him so dearly. He was a graduate of this grand institution, 1967. He's one of the greatest novelists of his generation. In fact, he stands next to William Faulkner in terms of being a vanilla brother who wrestles with what it means to be human under the vicious forces of empire. and white supremacy and male supremacy. His name is Russell Banks. And please, young students with all colors, take seriously the work of Russell Banks. Cloud Splitter, the greatest text written on John Brown, The Darling, written on Liberia, the Book of Jamaica, The Sweet Hereafter, The Rule of the Bone, rewriting Huckleberry Finn, with the black gem on that. Shit. That was not a shit, really. It's just a little Huckleberry Finn. How would you characterize it, my brother? Just that little dingy. Yeah, that little dingy trying to make it through the water. Now, why is that important? It's very important because there is this rich interplay between particularity and all of the historical specificities of people and culture and nations and empire. And that's all of us, because we're all embodied. But universality too. And universality is what? That's embodied too. But you have to dig deep enough into the depths of particularity to get at the universality. And the universality has to do with our humanity. And the deeper you actually dig, the dimmer it can be. And what do I mean by that? So when we look, for example, the Middle East and Afro-American community, now I come from a great people, of black people, who've had to deal with particularity and then try to come out through universality. And it's dimmer, why? Because first you see just how wretched we are as a species. Most of the history of the species is the history of oppression, domination, subjugation, organized greed, institutionalized hatred, routinized indifference to the suffering of the vulnerable, profound disappointment and disillusionment, losing sight, rendering invisible people who are suffering. That's who we are. And that's very important. That's humbling. But the challenge is not to fall into the pits of nihilism, cynicism, fatalism. How do we somehow stay on the tightrope and confront that wretchedness and recognize there's still something wonderful about we wretched creatures in terms of our possibilities and potentialities. And so when you look at the history of black people where I come from, and of course we in the South, this is North Carolina. I saw that picture of Coltrane when I walked in. I thought not just of Love Supreme, but I thought of the greatest lament ever produced in the history of the American Empire called Alabama. And that lament of those full of precious girls, the two Carols and Sister Edie and Sister Cynthia, murdered by cowardly white supremacists, terrorists, and yet producing in the face of that kind of hatred, love warriors like Martin King and John Coltrane, or on the other side of North Carolina, Nina Simone. That's the challenge for each and every one of us. So as we get into historical specificity, as we get into our social analysis, as we get into our attempt to keep track of the great cultural contributions of whatever people, but especially those from the Middle East, and especially black folk like myself, my brother Yusuf, our Metro Precious family. Where's your family, brother? All right. Wave, just wave. Give it up for this precious family. Come on, wave from Senegal. Yeah, from Senegal, absolutely. That's what we want to be able to do with each and every one of us here, because we're living in such grim moments, but it's not new at all. People have been here before. We just have to be able to keep track of it. And we're going to talk about this even more in terms of contemporary context in which people have their backs pushed against the wall.
I guess I got a question about the relationship between what you call historical particularity and the universal. And in doing my prep for this event, I've watched you a ton.
Speak right in that microphone, that technology.
You still good?
There you go. No, we want to hear your
So, in getting ready for this event, I watched you a ton, talking about the question of Palestine. And I watched folks interact with you. And one of the most kind of consistent objections that folks would make, it seemed to me, is about what about the suffering of other people, and particularly folks on the other side of a conflict, other side of an issue. And it seems to me that your answer to that argument or question is almost always more about the nature of love and the universality of love than it is about any specific point of historical.
What does it profit a human being to conquer the whole world and lose their integrity, honesty, decency, generosity? And then at your funeral, all they're talking about is your material toys and have little to say in terms of your courage, your character, your sense of learning how to muster the courage to love. Now, love, of course, has different objects. It could be philosophia, love of wisdom. Oh, that's Socrates. How courageous. But Socrates never cries, he never sheds a tear. That means I think he had a deep problem. Anybody that's never cried has never loved anybody. Jesus wept. You say, oh, Brother West, that's just your Christian bias. Yes, but it's still true. It's still true. You can be Socratic and think courageously against the grain and be a topos, and never subsumable under any category, any label, whatever it is, racial, gender, sexual orientation, or religious, or whatever, because you are distinctively you. No one like you. There'll never be another you in the history of the cosmos. It's like your fingerprint. But if you never learn how to love, that takes courage. But then the same is true with beauty. I don't downplay beauty. Beauty. Paul, I think, too. So beauty goes hand in hand with terror. Milton taught us, right? Beauty ain't nothing but the first touch of terror we can bear. That's Rilke in the first elegy, isn't it? He knew what he was talking about. All you gotta do is listen to a little Nina Simone, Backlash Blues. You can listen to that tonight. You know exactly what she's talking about. Backlash Blues against those courageous ones who attempted to love and receive terror and trauma and hatred in return. And so when I talk about the Middle East, I have a Christian tilt that I get at from Hebrew scripture. I'm always looking for the least of these. Who is subjugated? Who is being devalued and so forth? So when I look at the Middle East today, I see my precious Palestinian brothers and sisters. I see them being degraded. I see them being subjugated. I see them being oppressed, occupied. It's a moral and spiritual issue. If it were the other way around, there were Palestinians who were doing the same thing to Jews or Israelis, my rhetoric would be exactly the same, because it's a moral and a spiritual issue. If black folk had a black supremacist regime for over 200 and some years and had enslaved and lynched and Jim Crow and discriminated and lied about white folk in the name of black supremacy, I am in a vanilla solidarity on moral and spiritual grounds. But the actual history is one that is complicated because our precious Jewish brothers and sisters are what? They've been hated and terrorized and traumatized for 2,000 years. And you jump out of the burning buildings of Europe, Jew-hating Europe. And it's not just the Nazis. France has its version. What's Dreyfus about? Italy has its version, Italian fashion. And the history of expulsions and pogroms across Europe. We ain't even got to Russia yet, which is one of the naviers in terms of their hatred of Jews. Even the great Russian writers, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, magnificent geniuses, had trouble staying in contact with the humanity of Jews. Now, Chekhov is different. Very different. But every group has the capacity to be the best and the worst, has the capacity to coexist and treat others well, or has the capacity to dominate and subjugate like the cycle of the species has done. And that's what I see over the last 75 years. with our precious Jewish brothers and sisters in setting up a nation state and engaging in ways of losing contact with humanity, Palestinians, be it ethnic cleansing, be it marginalization, be it occupation, and now vicious, ugly attack. Yes, the killing of anybody, killing of precious Jewish brothers and sisters is for me a crime against humanity. Innocent, I'm not a pacifist, I believe in just war. When they're combatants, okay. Innocent, I'm against that. I call that into question. But I don't start with that particular moment. I understand the history of the ugliness, which doesn't justify it at all, but it puts it in a context such that when you then get, I don't know what is it now, I start to keep track, with the 13,000 precious children, that's beyond my capacity to grasp. I couldn't do that in 2014 when it was 553 Palestinian children in 50 days. Now we're talking about 10, 12,000. So the challenge becomes, how do we keep track of the humanity of everyone involved as we keep track of the structures of domination and the structures of subjugation, and then move towards some space in which maybe we can talk seriously about the non-negotiables in this context, which for me is Palestinian dignity and equality, Jewish safety and security. There should never, ever, ever, ever be another Holocaust, genocide, massive massacres and so forth, not just in the Middle East, but in Rwanda, in Ottoman Empire and Turkey with our precious Armenian brothers and sisters, Belgian Congo with Belgium, even before the Armenians. We've got a long, long history of it, human beings, of engaging in that kind of barbaric and bestial treatment of one another. But we have to attempt to be morally consistent. Now people come at me and say, oh, Brother West, you must be an anti-Semite because you seem to be in love with Palestinians. I said, well, you're right about being in love with Palestinians. Well, let me tell you why you're wrong about the label. Why? Because my love of Palestinians is tied to a love of all people who are catching hell, who are being crushed, whose pain is being rendered invisible. I say the same thing about Jewish brothers. I say the same thing about black brothers and indigenous peoples across the board. Now, do I pull it off in a perfect way? Absolutely not.
Pretty good, though.
Well, no, I don't pull it off because I'm very honest. I do love my mama better than the others I'm trying to work on. But I know what the standards are. And I aspire to those standards, but I'm honest enough to know that when it comes to my mother, wife, and kids, and so forth. And I said I'm a Christian, but not a pacifist, you see, so that you always have to let folk know that, yeah, I got some real gangster in me, even though I'm trying to work out the best of what's inside.
So I'm glad that the conversation has turned to the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, because I'd like to ask you about what Palestine and Palestinian Black solidarity has meant for you as a scholar and activist living and working in a US context. And there are many ways that, there are many directions we can take this topic, and I thought of some specific questions, but feel free to take this any way you want. One is, what has been a constant, and in particular, what can be achieved through solidarity that may not be possible through statecraft? And I'm thinking here about the Palestinian exception as articulated by Mark Montiel and Mitchell Zibning in their book Except for Palestine. And finally, could you speak to the role of ethics in Black Palestinian solidarity and sources of moral strength?
Absolutely. You know, I lived such a blessed life in the beginning when we and second son, Larry West. Now, I'm not going to be one half of you being they were. And I was blessed to spend a lot of time with three of the towering public intellectuals in the last 50 years in the history of the American Empire. Toni Morrison, blessed to teach with her. She spent a lot of time with Russell Benson, Joyce Keller's, with Edward Said, who I met in 1977 and became very close to him. Spent time in his living room again in 78. I remember talking about his work, Orientalism, before it came out after beginning about every year of 1984 when I got there to pick him up each time to give his lectures there on Grand Street, his favorite, one of my favorites is the great Italian philosopher Vico. Only Aquinas is actually more profound than Vico in the Italian tradition. Machiavelli is in competition. You shouldn't view intellectuals like racehorses, but still, it's nice to have a ranking sometimes. And the third is Noam Chomsky, who also makes the world to me. They're all three very, very different people. And all of them have their blindness. We all have our blindness. They've got profound insight and courage. And so with Edward Said, I was 24 years old when he began to reflect on the Palestinian question. Question I was like around 79. Covering Islam right after you. Some of you know his corpus. And so early on, I had exposure to one of the pioneering path-leading figures that was trying to call into question some of the lies that had been in place about the founding of Israel. It's like the lies that have been in place about the founding of America. The lies that have been in place about the founding of every nation state. How many nation states you got in the United Nations now? 193. Every one of them have narratives that tell lies about their origins. Every one. Across the board. Across the board. Why is that so? Oh, that's a human knowledge. Human from each. It's a human thing. And in fact, we can bring it closer to home. My hunch is, if I had a chance to have a rich dialogue with each and every one of you and reflecting on your origins, I know we got some serious truth tellers out there, though, but my hunch is there'd be some menacity, doses of menacity in your attempt to give an account of your own origins. People say, no, not this crowd. We'll tell only the truth, nothing but the truth. Okay, all right, I understand. But it is a human thing. And that's one of the reasons why Socratic dialogue and those wonderful young people as part of public discourse. Where are they? Where are the young folk? Part of that program. There they are, right in the middle, absolutely. The Socratic energy is so crucial. It has to be perennial. It has to be intense. It has to be pushed across the board. And for those who don't want it to be pushed, for those locked into forms of dogmatism and orthodoxy, then you might have some truths and half-truths, but you're not going far enough. And if you get locked into Manichaean views of the world, as all the good stuff is on your side, and all the other stuff is on somebody else's side, you are in for a rude awakening. Because sooner or later, experience will shatter your very narrow Manichaean view of the world. And so in that sense, it seems to me the ethics has something to do with the examples that we are exposed to, or the examples that we are willing to embrace. The examples of people you actually know in the Bible. Edward Said and I were marching in front of the New York Times 40 years ago, just trying to get them to use the word occupation. And a lot of people still won't even use the word. That was a big breakthrough. I remember when they reviewed Democracy Matters in 2004, and I used the word wall. And I was called anti-Semite because it was offensive. Everybody knows it's a wall. At that time, people were just reluctant to tell the truth. then you have to say, no, it looks like a wall to me. That's what I'm calling it. That ain't nothing to do with anti-Semitism, nothing else. Now, I stand corrected. I could be wrong. We do have to keep that electric working. Looks like an occupation to me. Looks like ethnic cleansing to me. Looks like genocide to me. Looks like apartheid to me. And you lay out the argument. No, this is not genocide. No, it's not occupation. Well, let's have an argument about it. Let's talk about the evidence. Let's talk about definition. You have a dialogue about it in a serious kind of way. But you also have to have the trust. And of course, that's something that is just hard to build over time. If you don't have trust, it's going to be hard to have a serious dramatic exchange. People think whatever you say is suspect because you don't have no trust. But if you're consistent and if you're trying to stay in contact with other people's humanity, there's always a possibility that the trust can set in long enough so you can learn and listen from one another. Even in these present day times where it seems as if the paranoid is on steroids.
Thank you for listening. So what you've offered us, I think, goes quite deeply into the questions that might come to mind. And what do they tell us about the possibility of more widespread resistance to systemic oppression? And so here I'm thinking more broadly about the values that we hold, that in some cases might get challenged during times where political expediency gets challenged, or is expected. For example, how some define terrorism, who is the us and the them, right? How that can be shaped by external factors, particularly in an age where facts no longer must be truthful. And then the very notion of values in a critical sense seems to be increasingly untethered from the ethical, moral obligations of the human good.
You know, I begin with one of the great essays on the history of religious ecumenical thought. It was given in 1965 by the inimitable Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He was a professor at Jewish Theological Seminary. He came over to Union Theological Seminary, where I now teach, where I started teaching in 1977. It was called No Religion is an Island. No religion is an island. Now, of course, just historically, we understand that these religions are always pulling from antecedent practices and so forth. I was blessed to study with the great Thorke Jacobson, who focused on Egypt and Mesopotamia and talked about that context as it then moves into Judaism and the Hebrew Scripture. And then that Jewish brother named Paul, who means so much to Christians, writing those letters in the context of the Roman Empire. And then Muhammad building on both legacies in that sense. But what he started off with, this is 1965, he said the largest ecumenical movement in the world is nihilism. 1965. He said that should be a trigger to bring the best of the religious traditions and those who are promoting the best of the religious traditions together. Because nihilism is, let's say, language of Plato, is the triumph of Thrasymachus over Socrates, right? Thrasymachus is talking about what? Might makes right. Power dictates everything. There's no space for morality in any moment of overwhelming barbarity. Nihilism means what? No values, no virtues, no standards. You get away with anything you can do. Obsessed with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. Survival of the slickest and richest and rich and most powerful. What a world. Much of human history. And then he reflected. He said, now let's look at the different versions. And he was talking primarily about the three historic religions in terms of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but he could have said similar things about Buddhism and Hindu and traditional religions all around the world. He said there are always deeply problematic, if not ugly, versions of all three of those. Like our sick, vanilla brothers and sisters in the Ku Klux Klan, who take my cross and put it on my neighborhood, which I experienced when my mother and father moved into the neighborhood. I said, dang, I'm tied to the cross. I'm a Christian. And I see their understanding of Christology is very different than mine. That's a vicious version of Christianity. Or a vicious version of Islam. All we need to do is look at Iran right now. Treatment of those precious young, especially Iranian sisters, but also brothers, in the name of Islam, losing sight of their humanity, repression. Judaism, versions of Judaism that lose sight of the humanity of others. And we have various examples of that. Not just in the state of Israel. I spend, of course, I live in Harlem, but I spend time in Brooklyn, and I have dialogues with folk across the board. I even had dialogues with Kahani's people in the 70s under very severe security. But I would go in and I would go out because I'm Socratic and try to, maybe I take it too far. But I believe in dialogue. And I'm trying to tell them, no, this version of Judaism is very different than Heschel's version of Judaism. It's different than Martin Buber's. And so then he moves on and says, well, how then do you try to bring together the prophetic versions of each tradition? Now, I know, for example, I don't exist without Malcolm X. I just don't exist. And he's Muslim to the core. Now, his father was a Baptist minister. No, I'm not just sneaking in Christianity again. This is a historical fact. He was a Garveyite and a historical and a Baptist, just like Muhammad Ali, Muslim, but grows up in the Baptist church in Louisville, Kentucky, and undergoes his own transformation. But I don't exist without Muhammad Ali, Muslim to the core. I learned, I'm inspired, I'm instructed, I'm delighted, and yet I don't believe they have a monopoly on truth. And the same would be true with prophetic Jews. Not just secular Jews, but prophetic followers of Judaism. And so I think when we think of religion in its multiple manifestations, I think it's a fact, at least I believe, maybe I'm a little bit too dim in this regard, but I think the prophetic versions of religious traditions and secular traditions tend to be a critical minority across the board. That's true for communism, that's true for socialism, that's true for anarchism, it's true for liberalism. Every tradition we human beings create and attempt to establish, you end up with a hegemonic group at the top, once they gain access to power, that do not want to be accountable. You see it in the patriarchy. You see it in the homophobia and transphobia. You see it in the chauvinism that comes out of the nations and the nation states. But there's always a cloud of witnesses. And the best of Islam, the best of Judaism, the best of Christianity. Bell Hooks. I don't exist without Sister Bell. She's Buddhist. Gandhi means much to me, but I wish she had hit the issue of caste and the Dalit brothers and sisters more intensely, but he still means much coming out of Hinduism. But I'm trying to keep track. Now, of course, our secular brothers and sisters say, you all need to get rid of religion. What you got to offer? Secularism, science. Science. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, ecological crisis. If science is not in some way informed by some values and virtues and visions that go beyond simply manipulating nature and trying to predict the future in light of past experience. Science is very good at that. But in and of itself, subject to the same uses, good or bad. And if that's the case, you think, my God, we're trapped. Absolutely. That's right. Comfortable to say we all have a death sentence in space and time. And we're trapped. We have to either choose integrity, honesty, decency, and be Socratic, or we marginalize it and go with reciprocity, go with might, go with power, go with oppression, side with oppression, and then when the catastrophe comes to our house, if we sided promoting catastrophe, we wonder why there's so few people who are in solidarity with us. Because we're too often concerned only when it comes to our house, our neighborhood, our kids, as if the kids on the other side of town don't matter. And that's true not just in Gaza or Uganda or Ethiopia. It's true in Chapel Hill. It's true in North Carolina. Same human challenge. Same both disappointment and then also it's something sublime about people who attempt to transgress and go against that. And there's degrees and gradations of that. We tend to think of the extreme examples of Martin King. Everybody didn't have to be a martyr or be so broke financially. What did he have, about $151 in his pocket when he died? Couldn't pay his life insurance, couldn't pay his mortgage. Wasn't for Harry Belafonte, they would have been pushed out of the house. Now see, I think Martin went too far. He's got to be more of a family man. You got to have your priority. No, Coretta, we worked this thing out. We got the kids. You saw Brother Dexter just died. His son, Brother Dexter just died. But that's the extreme case. But we understand what informs that kind of moral extremity, that kind of courageous extremity. He takes very seriously his calling and his vocation to be, in the language of John Coltrane, a force for good.
I'm glad you brought up Brother Malcolm. I wanted to bring to our attention the fact that solidarity between Middle Eastern communities and Black communities shouldn't be taken for granted. Actually, in the first half of the 20th century, Afro-Zionism was a thing. So in other words, but also what we're willing to believe in, right? Which I think, in so many ways, you've talked about how that's important. So in your view, what steps might we take to expand our individual and collective ethical imagination? I also want to ask a question, if we have time, about interfaith work, right? So what are the ways in which that becomes important, and what are the limits of that for people who are prayerful, but also are rooted in and invested in social justice work? I'll stop there so that we can...
Yeah. It's a very rich set of formulations, though, brother. I think in the past, when we had stronger families and communities and traditions, we could actually keep track of more persons who we thought embodied the kind of courage and integrity and generosity that I've been talking about. Remember, now, courage is the enabling virtue for all the other virtues. Without courage, the other virtues are empty. That's why Brother Martin used to always say, I'd rather be dead than afraid. Mary Ellen Pleasant was one of the great Black sisters, the first Black woman who was a multi-millionaire, who gave almost $500,000 to a brother named John Brown before he went to Harper's Ferry. They had the note from him when he was executed. She had made a robber baron, he dropped dead, she got all the money. And she used it for abolitionist purposes, and she would form all these different centers for poor people and homeless people and addicted people and so forth. She would begin every speech, I'd rather be a corpse than a coward. So that courage is so crucial. See, once courage itself is either reduced to a certain kind of narrow fearlessness without a spiritual moral dimension. And once you lose sight of the well-integrated institutions that socialize us, and that's where we are now. The market has almost taken care of all of that with all of its isolating rootlessness and deracination, trying to convince us to be consumers so that their profits go up. What happens? Well, here, the vocation of the artist becomes more important than ever. That's what Shelley meant when Shelley said poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And that last line of his posthumously published Defense of Poetry. What did he mean? He wasn't talking about versifiers. He's talking about all of those who use their imagination and empathy to authorize an alternative future that is wedded on not just making the world better, but especially making the world better on those whose humanity is being rendered invisible. And he understood that. That's part of what romantic poetry is all about. It's a moment in which it looks as if in revolutionary times things are being shattered. Traditions are being shattered. Communities are being shattered. And you have to somehow create some alternative. Now, Edmund Burke, the towering conservative thinker, was saying what? You all are playing with fire because without tradition, without strong families, you're going to end up with terror imposed from above from people who are self-righteous. You say, well, okay, Burke, that's fine. So what you going to do about the feudal regime and all of its injustices? Good question. I'm working on it. Some slow organic change is the way in which you do that. But you have to be mindful. That's why that dialogue is so very important between the so-called conservatives and the so-called revolutionaries and so on. But in our moment, we're living in such a moment of overwhelming decay in our empire. There's just no doubt about that. The suicides, the drug overdose, the young people, so deracinated and rootless, over against mom and dad, looking for what? Looking for the same thing every generation looks for, which is what? Love, affirmation, sense of vision. How do you deal with death and dread and disappointment? How do you deal with catastrophe? How do you fortify yourself with an armor such that you can go from womb to tomb with some dignity before the worms get your body? Every generation's had those questions. This generation has weaker armor. So the artists now play an even more fundamental role. And thank God that we've got a whole wave of young brothers and sisters of all colors who more and more understand the role of art that enacts a certain courage, empathy, imagination to allow us to get beyond the superficial elements of the present in order to raise the deeper issues of life, death, joy, sadness, sorrow, sublimity, majesty, the things that have sustained human being from the very beginning. And now we know our artists can be just as commodified and just as narrow and just as parochial, provincial. But I mean, here in North Carolina, I mean, good God Almighty, you got Maceo Parker coming out of this place. He's one of the funk masters. And what Maceo represents with James Brown and George Clinton and Bootsy Collins, and we haven't got to Aretha yet, is to get beneath the superficiality and get at where the real love and freedom and blood actually resides. And that's in the funk. That's in the funk. So there's another blues man, vanilla, that comes out of Ireland named Samuel Beckett. And he called it The Mess. Similar point. Because to be human is to deal with what? Fear, insecurity, anxiety. They have to come to terms with love and freedom and integrity. And if you meet the challenge, you have to go to the funk and you emerge a better human being. And Plato, in so many ways, had already prefigured this when he said, the love of wisdom itself is predicated on wrestling with death and the forms of death precondition of death. And by death, he didn't mean just physical death. He meant learning how to die in order to learn how to live. So I'm blessed to teach my dear brother Robert George. And we always tell our students when you come in the classroom, you are here to learn how to die. And this day I thought we just wanted a grade, a credential and a degree. No. You want to learn how to die. That's what Dorothy Day wrote the eulogy for Martin Luther King Jr. the day after he was murdered in Memphis. Martin Luther King Jr. learned how to die daily. Where did you get that from? Jewish brother Paul. Christian New Testament. Christians must learn how to die daily. What does it mean to learn how to die? To give up certain assumptions and presuppositions and prejudices that you have. And when you give it up, that's a form of death so that you can live more courageously, more compassionately, more with vision, and learn how to stay in contact with others. It's like when you fall in love with somebody, something in you dies. I won't ask for personal testimony here, but I know some people know what I'm talking about. Some of your narcissism and hedonism, some of your sense of being lonely, some of your sense of being fearful. You're making a leap, and once you get entangled with that other person, you feel as if you are a new being. You're in a new space. You're in a new zone because something in you has died in order for you to be more human. You are now in love. This is little Curtis Mayfield so in love tonight. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, it might be like Sappho, become bittersweet quick. But 'tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. The intense sense of being human. And that's true for any form of love. Love of wisdom and education. Love of a person. Love of an ideal. And so that intimate relation of love and death becomes crucial. What happens in a culture that prides itself on being death-ducking and death-denying and death-dodging? What happens to a culture that believes it's always innocent, even when it's the authors of the devastation? What happens to a culture that believes it was just born with liberty and don't look around at the folk you subjugate? Chickens come home to roost. Sooner or later, you're going to reap what you sow. Sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with that which has been repressed. And it comes back with power. We indigenous people, we've been here, enslaved folk. We still here. The women, we always here. And we can go on and on. We haven't even got to the imperial victims of the American Empire, the Philippines and Guam, and in Puerto Rico and Cuba, let alone the Middle East, back to the Middle East. Let alone Iraq, 1953, with the U.S.-UK overthrow of the democratic regime, and so many examples of that in Latin America and so many other places. Brother West, you sound like you're anti-American. No, you missed the point. I'm anti-injustice. I'm anti-injustice. No matter who does it. Right, no matter what nation does it, anti-injustice across the board. But never, ever surprised by evil. Never. I'm never paralyzed by despair. I know all the love that's been poured into me by my mother and father and family in Shiloh Baptist Church, and Reverend Willie P. Cook and Deacon Hinton and Sarah Ray, my vacation Bible school teacher. And all of those who came before, the Frederick Douglasses and the Sojourner Truths and others. But they poured so much love in me, it would take 10 lifetimes for me to succumb to despair. But I'm on intimate relation with despair every day. That's what it is to be a blues man. You're in intimate relation with catastrophe. Nobody sees in Gaza. You with overwhelming despair. Oh, when I look at the eyes of those precious Palestinian brothers and sisters and that unbelievable sense of determination. Some of them have victory signs walking in front of the camera. I say, my God, where does that come from? Palestinians aren't the only one that have it, but you can see it most clearly now. Jewish brothers and sisters, you could have seen it when they were so viciously attacked. Look at that Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion in 1943 and all of that Jewish dignity and determination in the face of that kind of subjugation. We met our brother Noah from the restaurant. I don't know if he here. Brother Noah, yeah, there's my dear brother. We were just talking last night about this though, brother. Oh, what a tradition. But it's human all the way down, and in this particular case, it's Palestinian. But it's been a whole host of other peoples too, and we hope it will be in subsequent time. But it depends on the younger generation. If you give up on Socratic thinking, the courage to think for yourself, you give up on having the courage to love, to having the courage to be in solidarity, the whole planet will not only be lost, but fascism will become thoroughly hegemonic across the board. That's what it looks like. It's happening. Not just in other places. Here too. Here too. But on the other hand, don't be paralyzed by despair. What we do makes a difference. If you look closely, for oppressed folk around the world, it's always been a grim and dim situation. But they kept fighting, they kept swinging, they kept loving, they kept laughing, they kept organizing, they kept their solidarity connections here, around the world. And that's a beautiful thing. And that to me is good news in so many ways.
Another piece of good news, we got about 15 more minutes and we didn't expect it to take Q&A, so excited for all of us.
Absolutely.
I want to end up on a kind of last question, which is a question about your advice to young people. I want to take it up from your perspective of catastrophe and despair. Oh, what? Sorry, see? Yeah. Take it, yeah, thank you. Take it up from catastrophe and despair. So it seems to me, and that's one of the most beautiful descriptions of the orders of sin and death that I've ever heard. And, one of the things that you note in both secular and religious traditions is that, in some sense, it's a truncated sense of love that creates all the evils that we've talked about. I wonder.
Xenophon actually has Socrates dancing. I don't know whether he's on or off the beat or not. But it says you want something beyond just the critical reflection. You got to have something that you put your whole self into. Christians call kenosis, where you empty yourself into a person. You empty yourself into a cause. You empty yourself into your calling or your voice. And thank God, the younger generation more and more is hungry for that. Definitely, I know J. Cole is from North Carolina. Oh, that's serious, brother. Serious, brother. Very much so. He puts his whole self into it, which means what? He takes a risk. He knows he's going to get in trouble. False prophet. You talking about his friend in hip-hop. Am I right? That's courage. Young folk. Intellectual humility. Moral tenacity. Situating yourself in traditions. Not one tradition, a variety of traditions. Bigger than you. And trying to allow the best inside of you. What is the best inside a human being? Integrity, honesty, what Jane Austen called constancy. Consistency. And it usually means you're headed toward trouble. Christians would say, cruciform. You're headed toward the cross. Precious Jewish brothers and sisters would say in Hebrew scripture, we're headed toward the promised land. What makes you think that Pharaoh is not on both sides of the bloody Red Sea? That's Ecclesiastes. That's a possibility. Everywhere you go, everywhere you look, no breakthrough. What you gonna do? Sing a song. Crack a grin. Sustain your smile. Still love your children. Support your family. opt for things that seem to be impossible. And when they come about, people will tell you it was inevitable. That's the history of oppressed people. That's the history of life. And so for young folk, you want to say, this is not transactional. This is not quid pro quo. This is not push some button and you're going to have a breakthrough. No, this is messy, funky, human, all the way down. And sometimes you have to make a choice where it looks as if your cause has a chance of a snowball in hell. The Queen of Gospel from this town, Shirley Caesar. What does she say? You step out on nothing and you land on something. And that's not just kindergarten. That's chocolate side of Raleigh, North Carolina. Similar point. You're making a way out of no way. Why? Because it's the only way you can proceed to preserve your own integrity. Even though it looks as if you have no chance of winning. You redefine what win means in terms of preserving your sense of integrity and honesty and decency, holding on to the love of your grandmother, grandfather, and child, connecting with neighbor when it's thoroughly unpopular. I think of the debate between North Carolina Chapel Hill with the Vanderbilt figures in the 1920s. You remember that big fight between the fugitive agrarians versus old Howard Washington Odom right here in North Carolina. He had written 2 dissertations on black people. And they said, what in the world are you interested in these black people for in the 1920s in North Carolina? Don't you know what the norm is? Don't you know what the mainstream is? You keep these black folk in their place. You keep them devalued. No, he's looking at it also from the vantage point of the black folk himself in his dissertation. And the result is what? He cuts against the grain. Now, I'm not saying he's John Brown, but for a vanilla brother, he's cutting against the grain in a significant way. And it opens the door to a university in North Carolina, Chapel Hill, 2023. So Odom and his legacy with Rupert Vance and the others has tremendous impact as opposed to some of the brothers at Vanderbilt, the early Alan Tates and John Ransoms and others. And this is not just antiquarian at all, because every institution has its own vital traditions. Thomas Wolfe ain't no joke coming out of this place. Meaning what? Meaning that there's much to pull from. I was blessed to meet Sister Sonia Hayes Stone. She was the first one to invite me to the University of North Carolina. I'll always remember her. Oh, what tremendous power, integrity, grace, elegance, black sisters, Sarah Lawrence undergrad, Northwestern PhD, coming to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. They all three going to be the most important radical theorists in the United States, coming from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. That's the history. At its best for me. Not just my judgment, at its best. And the question becomes, how do you situate yourself in relation to that history? Not by imitating, but by building on it so that 30, 40 years from now they can say, oh, in the 2020s, with ecological catastrophe, nuclear catastrophe, seemingly right around the corner, grotesque wealth inequality, the escalating hatred of different peoples, deep, indescribable crisis in the Middle East, maybe in China over Taiwan, certainly in Russia with a gangster named Putin, wrestling with the Ukrainian brothers and sisters, but also responding to the expansion of NATO. How do you deal with all of that in such a way that they will look back on us as if there was some cracked vessels at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who tried to hold up the bloodstained banner of truth and justice and love when it looked like they had the chance of a snowball in hand? Who were they? Ooh, there's one there, there's one, and there's another one back there. How do you I'll be.
All right, let's take one from the audience. First one, how do we raise, and more importantly, sustain, the collective consciousness and wisdom of the masses? How do you stop the loss of wisdom and knowledge over generations so that the horrors of history don't play on them? That's some, but
We don't want to fetishize any group or any region or any nation by fetishizing and describing magical powers and think somehow they are pure vessels of virtue. Not at all. Not at all. I'm from the ghetto. Ghetto is different than a hood. Very important to keep in mind. I love my brothers and sisters in the hood, but the ghetto is Donny Hathaway, Leroy Hudson, the classic of 1970. And the ghetto was a place of deep sympathy and empathy and courage in that song. The hood is crushed by organized greed, families shattered in communities, people deracinated, sensibly longing too often for young brothers and sisters tied to gang activity. Same black people over time, but different historical circumstances. So it's important that when we talk about the masses, we're never talking about anything homogeneous and monolithic and think that somehow the masses have this overwhelming courage and wisdom. No, they're human beings that have the same challenges as the ruling class. It's just the ruling class is often more tilted toward organized greed, tied to comfort and convenience, and too often at their worst, indifferent to the plight of those in the ghettos. And the ghettos, of course, have different colors. Right? The vanilla ghetto ones, the indigenous ones, the Asian ones, the brown ones, and so forth. So when we talk about the masses, we don't want to just go in thinking, well, these professional managerial folk, they're just so cowardly and obsessed with their jobs and their money and position. Let me turn to the masses where I will find overwhelming virtue. You got to get out the crack pipe now. Don't dehumanize the masses. They are as human as everybody else. You're going to find some of the most magnificent people in the world. I've taught in prison for 42 years now. You're going to find some of the most magnificent people in the world. And you're also going to find, just like you find on Wall Street or the White House, gangsters, crypto thugs. I'm talking about folks who are gangsters 3 days a week rather than 7. They're human across the board. And it's the same attempt to discern integrity, honesty, and decency with the masses, with the upper classes, and middle classes. It's a human thing across the board. But that doesn't wipe away, of course, the structures that are in place and the institutional forms of oppression. So I think that's very important in regard to that one.
well, so this one is a great follow-on, although it's kind of a deep cut. What possibilities for interracial solidarity do you see in light of Afro-pessimist claims against a universal human subject? I'm thinking of Wilderson here, which is what Frank Wilderson calls junior partners to
Any form of retail pessimism. Anybody who's a realist about human history, a realist about any group, has good reason to be pessimistic at particular moments. That's retail. I'd say the same thing about skepticism. John Dewey makes this wonderful distinction between the retail skepticism and the wholesale skepticism in his Gifford lectures, The Quest for Certainty, in 1929. There's truths in skepticism. The great Stanley Cavell, my teacher, makes the same point. But it's also important to be skeptical about skepticism. It's very important too. If you follow through on the logic of pessimism, you're never, ever able to answer the human question of how to live. But if you're really a pessimist, and really skeptic, then it means the death of a mosquito on the wall has the same value as the death of your mama or your daddy. Now, you might be able to brag about the intellectual rigor of your pessimism and skepticism, but if you go around bragging that a mosquito has the same value as your mama, people are going to look at you and say, this is a Keith Sweat moment. Something just ain't right. You lost your humanity by being tied to a logical consistency. And so, my Afro-pessimist brothers and sisters, I say, join the tradition. You're not the first one. What the Garveyans said the same. We got a whole, am I right, my brother? You got a whole tradition of pessimists. But the question was, did they end up being spectators? No. Did they end up being paralyzed? No. Then they had something more than just pessimism. Something else was working. They had some hope built in. Had nothing to do with optimism. Pessimism, flip side of optimism. Just like cynicism is the flip side of sentimentalism. You scratch a sentimentalist, the great Oscar Wilde said, and you'll find a cynic. If you look at a cynic, you usually find one who was once sentimental, had their expectations shattered, and become deeply disillusioned and cynical. If you're full of hope, you're in the middle ground. Not because it's a golden mean, but because it's tied to your humanity. Your humanity. That's why Curtis Mayfield said, keep on pushing. That's not optimism, that's hope. That's why in the 1960s they said, we are prisoners of hope. Not optimism or pessimism. And the blues is what? Neither optimistic or pessimistic. Not at all. It's how I'm going to get up in the morning when this heartache is still messing with me. That's Billie Holiday, good morning, heartache. But I keep getting up anyway. How come? Because I got things to do. I got people to love. I got songs to sing. And Lester Young is still smiling at me through his saxophone. What you gonna do, Billy? I'm gonna be a prisoner of hope. Could you bring the microphone? I got something to say.
All right, so we've got time for one more. There were a number of questions submitted essentially about free speech and what your opinion is in relation to cultures of expression around campus. How do you think about it in relationship to the Israel-Palestine conflict too? So I'll let you.
I've been here for a long time, and I've been talking for a good while. And I deeply appreciate you all being patient with me. And let's give it up for these three men. I tend to be deeply libertarian in my commitment to free speech, but not just free speech, what the Greeks call parrhesia, P-A-R-R-H-E-S-I-A. Remember line 24a in Plato's Apology, when Socrates says in his trial, the cause of my unpopularity was parrhesia, plain speech, frank speech, unintimidated speech. Foucault translated it as fearless speech. So that's not just free speech, but it's a speech that's been filtered through some critical reflections that's trying to gain access to a quest for truth that none of us have a monopoly on. And it's in response to other persons who are engaged in parrhesia as well. And that's a deep love, absolutely. And at the same time, it's tied to a phronesis, a sense of practical wisdom and timing. So being able to sustain a conversation that's mediated with respect, even when there's the deepest forms of disagreement, because you know you can still learn something, and yet at the same time recognize that you got something to say. And I'm looking at the Dean of DEI here. Where's my sister? Just wave, my dear sister. Give it up for our dear sister here. I see. Because it's very important, you see, in our discourses of diversity and equity and inclusion. You say, look, we're fundamentally concerned about truth. Whatever the categories are, we're concerned about truth. We're concerned about respect. We're concerned about justice. And we want to be jazz-like, which means we want to be able to lift all the voices and be able to learn from those voices so that we're flexible and fluid and improvisational enough to know that we got to keep the process going. Not just the music going, but the conversation going and the struggles of solidarity on the ground, as well as in the classroom, as well as in the mosque, the synagogue, the church. And I'm a Christian, but I'm a hang loose Black Baptist, so we go to the nightclubs and the jazz clubs as well. So when people see me there, oh, I thought you were a Christian. Well, I'm a loose Christian. I love Jesus and the rest is commentary. You know? But the crucial thing I want to leave you with, though, is this sense that it's up to us in terms of what we do. And it's just a matter of choosing to be a part of a cloud of witnesses. And in the end, it goes so far beyond skin pigmentation, so far beyond gender and sexual orientation, even that we ought to be vigilant in terms of defending folk. It goes even beyond empire. Yes, I'm a deep anti-imperialist across the board, but I also recognize that people can make choices that go against their ways in which they've been socialized if they are convinced that it's wrong. And it's not just a matter of abstract allies. It's very important. People come up to me all the time. Brother West, what do you think of your white ally? I said, well, let me talk to him. Oh, okay. Oh, another sister come. Oh, I'm your white ally. Oh, really? Well, let me tell you a story. Miles Davis had a quartet, and there was a white brother named Bill Evans who played the piano. You think Miles would turn to Bill Evans and say, now we're going to have the white ally solo? He's in the band. He's in the band. Sly Stone had a white drummer too, didn't he? Named Craig, and he had another white brother playing the saxophone named Jerry. He's called Sly in the family Stone. You think he turned to Craig on the drummer song and say, now we got the white ally gonna play the drum for us? No, he's in the Mother God Blessed band. And when you're in solidarity, you're in the same band. And I want to be in the same band with oppressed people. I want to be in the same band with Socratically oriented people. I want to be in the same band of people who choose to be a force for good no matter who they are, even when they're at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. But thank you all so very much. Stay strong, stay strong, stay strong.
Thank you, everyone. As we bring this evening to a close, I want to also extend my heartfelt gratitude to everyone. First to the panel, our own faculty, as well as Dr. West, obviously, and all of you for your insightful questions and for the respectful conversation. And I want to say that I hope you feel the warmth and joy that was in this room. And wishing you all a wonderful evening